So I will very quickly ask people to spend a sentence or so just introducing themselves. My name is Carl Copestake. I chair the Chamber Planning and Infrastructure Forum, and I'm head of planning at Knights. So Sarah?
Good morning, I'm Sarah Williams. I'm Chief Executive of Staffordshire Chambers of Commerce.
Thank you. Vicky?
Sorry, I should be a bit quicker than that off the mark. My name is Vicky Hardy. I'm Sarah's PA at the Chamber.
Thank you. Ashley?
Hi, I'm Ashley Booth. I'm the project manager at Dog and Bone Projects, and one of the most popular projects we've done is the pot bank in Stoke.
Thank you. Beverly? For Ian's sake as well, Beverly's an architect based in the Staffordshire Moorlands, and hopefully she'll be able to engage at some point. Mike?
Beverly, can you hear us? Yeah, I'll take that to be a yes.
Morning, everybody. I'm Mike Herbert. I currently chair the Chamber's Transport Forum. Retired at the end of last year after 30-odd years in property. I'm a chartered surveyor, and I was regional director for St Modern Properties PLC, doing major regeneration and development projects.
Thanks, Mike. Faye?
Good morning, everyone. My name's Faye. I'm a flood risk and drainage consultant and founder of Reynard Consulting Limited, which specialises in pre-planning design.
Thank you, Faye. Steve?
Good morning, everyone. Steve English here. I'm Senior Partner at Wood Goldstraw Architects in Stoke-on-Trent.
Thank you, Patrick.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. My name is Patrick Redmond. I'm Architect Director at CTD Architects in Leeks, Staffordshire.
Thank you. Andrea?
Hi, I'm Andrea Bruce. I work with Carl at Knights, and I'm a partner rather than a partner.
Thanks, Andy. Joanne?
Morning, I'm Jo Kemp. I work at Stoke and Staffordshire Local Enterprise Partnership with the title of Business Engagement Officer.
Thank you. Adam? Thank you, Adam, who's a senior planner with Wardell Armstrong.
Yep.
Thank you. And we've got the ELM group. Good morning.
Yeah, my name's Martin.
Sorry, and Joanne, sorry.
Yeah, I've introduced myself.
Okay, ELM group back on.
So yeah, Martin Lennon from Elm Group.
Good morning.
In Stafford, member of the Stafford Local Area Board.
Thank you. Good morning. And just I think that introduces everybody. Moving on to the minutes from last time, the previous meeting. Everybody received those and finds them satisfactory? Good. Thank you. There were no matters arising from that, as per my conversation with Vicky this morning. So thank you to Ian for joining us this morning. I have circulated his CV. Over the past month or so, we've had a raft of planning legislation that's been passed and which is relevant to your day-to-day jobs. Knights have produced a detailed summary of this, and I'll circulate this to our members later today, along with Ian's note. But to help make sense of this, I'd like to introduce Ian Ponter, who's an eminent barrister from King's Chambers, Manchester. Ian has been instructed by Knights on a number of occasions, and I've also had the pleasure of being cross-examined by him. So I know firsthand just how effective Ian can be. And on that note, over to you, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Well, you seem to have recovered all right.
Thank you.
So, as Carl said, he's asked me to sort of give you a bit of a roundup of legislative changes that's been made by the government, specifically in response to COVID. And when I had a look through all of them, some of them are procedural, and it represents the government's attempt to try and keep the process of planning control ticking over, notwithstanding lockdown restrictions, and some of them are a bit more substantive, and I'll come to those in a moment or two. What I thought I'd do, I've tried to be comprehensive. I can't guarantee that I've not missed anything, but I've tried to be comprehensive, and I started chronologically in March. And I think lockdown started on the 23rd of March, didn't it? On the 24th of March, the day after, there was an amendment to the General Permitted Development Order that allowed restaurants and cafes, drinking establishments, as they're referred to in the order, to offer food takeaway service. So that was the first legislative step that the government took. It was the day after lockdown started, and it allowed takeout service from restaurants and other places. And I think it's fair to say that quite a few restaurants, cafes, bars and pubs have made use of that, as have I. So that was March. We then moved into April, when I think the government's attention turned to how local planning authorities were going to be able to continue to operate successfully. And so we had within the Coronavirus Act 2020, and that was a piece of legislation that was very swiftly produced. It received royal assent actually on the 25th of March. But within that act, and it allowed for a whole series of things to happen, but specifically in respect of planning and local government, Section 78 allowed the government to make regulations governing local authority meetings. And they did produce regulations to govern local authority meetings. I'm not going to read out the dreadful name of the regulations because it'd take too long, but suffice to say they came into force on the 4th of April. So the Coronavirus Act received consent on the 25th, assent on 25th of March. It allowed regulations to be produced, and within 2 weeks, those regulations were produced. And what they do is facilitate remote attendance at local authority meetings. And that's not just for members of the public and third parties who want to participate in the meetings. Importantly, it's for members as well. So what the 4th of April 2020 regulations do is allow members of local planning authority committees to meet and determine planning applications without all being in the same room in the same building. So Regulation 5 allows members to attend remotely as long as they can hear what's going on and be heard. Those are the requirements. And as far as I'm aware, quite a few local authorities were pretty quick to take up those provisions and have been conducting planning committee meetings remotely and largely successfully. I think other authorities perhaps have been less keen to go down that route because they see some logistical difficulties, and instead what they've been doing or tending to do is rely on delegated powers to officers to determine planning applications to keep the wheels turning. And I know Manchester City Council is one that I think has relied very heavily on delegating powers to senior officers to determine all manner of planning applications. So those are some regulations that govern council meetings. As I say, they came out early April. We then moved to May, and again, this is a procedural measure, really, just designed to try and keep the process going. And it's an amendment to the Development Management Procedure Order. Now, the Development Management Procedure Order contains all of the provisions, as I know many of you will know, regarding things like publicity for planning applications. And what those publicity requirements generally sought were physical things to take place. So site notices, notification to neighbours made by post, pieces of paper flying around, or a advertisement or notice in a local newspaper. Those were the sorts of measures in the Development Management Procedure Order that conventionally you had to follow in order to publicise a planning application. in order to deal with lockdown restrictions, the government thought, well, we need a different way. And so we have these amending regulations that came into force on the 14th of May, and they provide alternative methods for publicising planning applications if it's not reasonably practicable to publicise in the conventional way, that is by site notice, writing to neighbours, or putting a notice in the local newspaper. If it's not reasonably practicable to do those things, it is possible to publicise a planning application via electronic means. And so the council can publicise a planning application via its website. What it's required to do according to the regulations is take reasonable steps to notify interested parties of the existence of the website. So it's got to try and notify people of the new means of notification. And it can do that by using social media and communicating through electronic means. And the planning practice guidance, which is the guidance published by the government on the internet, planning practice guidance gives all sorts of examples about how a local planning authority can do that to make members of the public aware of the website where they can find information about new planning applications. The only other thing to note about the amending regulations to the Development Management Procedure Order is that I think, bearing in mind that there might be some hiccups in notifying people, the period given to third parties to make representations on planning applications, this is for non-EIA development, is extended from 2 weeks to 3 weeks. So they've given a bit more leeway for people to put in their comments on planning applications. So those were the early, if you like, the early procedural steps taken in April and May. Nothing was produced in June. It was being produced, but it wasn't actually coming into force in June. But once we got into this month, July, we had the Planning and Business Act 2020. That act received royal assent last Wednesday, 22nd of July, and it contains a raft of provisions that are less procedural, more substantive, and are designed to help developers. And I'll come to the main raft of provisions to help developers in a moment. There is one other point that I wanted to mention first. Within section 16 of the Business and Planning Act, there is a shortcut process to extend construction hours. So it's not unusual for planning permissions to contain a condition that limits hours of construction. Section 16 of the Business and Planning Act contains a new procedure for varying those restrictions contained in a condition restricting construction hours. That came into force, and it's section 16 of that act, that came into force yesterday. And what a developer can do is apply in a simple way, not having to use section 73 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990, which is the conventional route for varying conditions in a planning permission, can apply in a simple way to vary a condition that imposes construction hours. It needs to be made the application needs to be made in writing, but it can be made electronically, and it can suggest a change to start 2 weeks later. So I can apply, if I'm developing a site, I've got a condition in my consent saying you can't work between, or you can only work between 8 and 6 or whatever. I can say, right, I apply to extend those hours. I want to start that 2 weeks from now, and I'd like you to determine my application swiftly. That the council has to determine within 2 weeks. If you don't get a determination in 2 weeks, the application is deemed to have been allowed. And so if you don't hear back from the council within the fortnight, you just get on with your modified hours. There are no publicity or consultation requirements imposed. So the public doesn't need to know about the application. And you as the developer don't have to pay the council a fee. So that's a sort of standalone little provision that the government have put into this act to try and aid developers deal with, you know, maybe social distancing constraints on a site, to extend the hours over which construction can take place, or just to get things going on a site. I don't know how readily it's going to be taken up. It's just going to be a question of waiting to see. Right, the next main raft of provisions in the 2020 Act, the Business and Planning Act of 2020, that really go to the heart of the government's efforts to help the development industry, is a whole load of provisions relating to extending the life of planning permissions. Now, that set of provisions starts at section 17 of the 2020 Act. They come into force on the 19th of August. And section 17 introduces new sections into the Town and Country Planning Act of 1990 and addresses the position with full planning permissions. So section 17 is directed at full planning permissions. I'll come back to outline planning permissions in a moment. They're dealt with in a different section. So basically, if your full planning permission is set to expire on a date between the 19th of August and the 31st of December inclusive, then that planning permission is automatically extended until the 1st of May. I think as originally drafted, the bill was suggesting the 1st of April, but in the House of Lords, it got amended. Another month has been added. And so the automatic extension date, if you've got a full consent that expires between the 19th of August and the end of the year, is 1st of May. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to make an application. It's simply deemed to have been extended. If you've got a full planning permission that expired or is due to expire on a date between the 23rd of March, i.e. lockdown date, and the 18th of August, the day before these provisions come into force, so 23rd of March to the 18th of August, and again, I think that's an inclusive period, then your planning permission may be extended to the 1st of May if you get something called an additional environmental approval granted. So that's a new thing, an additional environmental approval. And you apply for that from the local planning authority. Again, I think in writing and electronically. The council has 28 days to determine your application. That period can be extended by agreement between the applicant and the council, but it can't be extended for any greater period than 21 days. And if the council failed to determine your application within the 28-day period or the agreed longer period, then it's deemed to have been granted. there is some draft guidance about how this should operate that has been published by the Housing, Communities and Local Government Department. What I've done, Vicky, is put a link to that in this speaking note, so you can go and have a look at the draft guidance. It's quite helpful, actually. And what the draft guidance says is that there should be no fee for making an application for an additional environmental approval. So the council isn't going to get a fee for this. Similarly, there is no requirement to notify, publicise or consult. So members of the public won't necessarily hear about an application for additional environmental approval that could have the effect of resurrecting a planning permission that expired last month and extending it to the 1st of May of next year. What the draft guidance says is that there really is an expectation that these things are going to be granted. What the draft guidance says is that if you're dealing with a development that isn't EIA development and doesn't engage the habitats regulations, which is all about protecting important species and habitats, if it's not EIA development and those habitat regs aren't engaged, then the expectation is you will get your additional environmental approval. If it's EIA development or the habitats regs are engaged, then as long as your previous assessments, when you put in your application for planning permission, remain up to date, you should get your approval. If not, if things have moved on and your EIA assessment and habitats regs assessment is out of date, you're going to get a refusal. That's what the draft guidance indicates. So that's the provision with regard to extending full planning permissions. I should probably just note, and this goes for all of these provisions relating to extending consents, that the council has to give reasons for its decision on the additional environmental approval, and there's a right of appeal to the Secretary of State under Section 78 of the Act. So that's full consents. The position with regard to outline consents is then at Section 18 of the Business and Planning Act. That also comes into force on the 19th of August. And obviously it has to deal with the position where reserved matters applications have not yet been made. So if you've got an outline planning permission that requires submission of reserved matters applications by a date between the 23rd of March, lockdown day, and the 31st of December, then that date is automatically extended to the 1st of May 2021. You don't have to do anything, no application required. If reserved matters have to be made on a date between 23rd of March and the end of the year, that date is extended to the 1st of May next year. And so again, there'll be many outline planning permissions that had a date for submission of reserved matters applications from the 23rd of March to the day we sit here today that have expired in effect. Well, they're resurrected. Those planning permissions are resurrected, and the developer has until the 1st of May next year to put in reserved matters applications without having to do anything. So that's reserved matters applications. In terms of starting development, if your outline planning permission requires development to begin on a date between the 19th of August and the 31st of December, that date is automatically extended to the 1st of May next year. Don't have to do anything, no application required. It's just deemed to have happened. We then have the period 23rd of March to the 18th of August. if your outline planning permission required development to begin by a date between 23rd of March and the 18th of August, then that date can be extended to the 1st of May next year, but again, only if additional environmental approval is given. And just as with regard to the full planning permissions, you've got to make an application in writing. I think electronically will do. Has to be determined within 28 days, subject to agreement, but no more than a 21-day extension. And if not determined, deemed granted. Same raft of provisions for developments that engage the environmental impact assessment regs or the habitat regs. If you're in that boat and if your assessments remain up to date, you'll get your approval. If not, you're going to get a refusal. And again, there's a right of appeal to the Secretary of State if you get a refusal. Then finally, to mention in this suite of measures, because it would be incomplete without dealing with it, there are listed building consents dealt with in broadly the same way, actually a lot simpler for listed building consents. If you've got a listed building consent that requires work to begin on a date between the 23rd of March and the 31st of December, then that date is simply automatically extended to the 1st of May 2021. Don't have to do anything, no application required to the local planning authority. It simply takes place. And as I say, there's draft guidance. It's called draft guidance. I'm not entirely sure why it's draft. It's been published by the government. It's accessible to all. And once these measures come into force on the 19th of August, I assume it's going to remain, that guidance is going to be unchanged. So it'll be worth just looking at that guidance. If you think you're dealing with an application for additional environmental approval, for example, it is obviously well worth looking at that draft guidance, as it's now called. Finally, within the Business and Planning Act 2020, there's specific provision made for the form that planning appeals take. Obviously, in the 1990 Act, at the moment, there is provision for deciding how a planning appeal is to be determined, either by inquiry, informal hearing, or written representations. And the inspectorate decides that under the provisions of the 1990 Act. What Section 20 of the Business and Planning Act 2020 allows is for so-called hybrid appeals. So they might be part written, part informal hearing, and part inquiry. They came into force last week on the 22nd of July and are going to be permanent. I think they will remain with us in perpetuity or until another change to the planning system takes place. And the hope is that that will speed up the appeal process. In my experience, and Carl, no doubt you'll have some experience of this, my experience is that post Rosewell, there have been effectively hybrid inquiries. So within an inquiry, you'll deal with certain issues by way of informal roundtable discussion. And usually it's things like landscape impact or 5-year housing land supply. And then other issues will still be dealt with by way of formal cross-examination. So we already sort of have that in the inquiry forum. This is going to formalise things and it will allow the inspector to say, right, we're going to have this issue dealt with by written reps, this issue dealt with by informal hearing, this issue can be subject to formal cross-examination in the formal inquiry process. Just one other legislative change to note, as far as I could see, and that I picked up, that has taken place, and that is the postponement of neighbourhood plan referendums. There were some regulations that had the effect of postponing all sorts of different referenda neighbourhood plan referendums being one such. And if your, as far as I understand is, if your neighbourhood plan referendum was due to take place between the 16th of March of this year and the 5th of May next year, then it will be postponed. I'm not sure till when. And the government have said they're going to keep all of that under review. In the meantime, as I understand it, national guidance says that if a neighbourhood plan has got as far as the local authority intending it to send it for referendum, then that will attract significant weight. Neighbourhood plan referenda, neighbourhood plan examinations can continue to take place. They're often dealt with in writing by written reps. If a hearing is necessary, then it can take place virtually, so the guidance says, and online publicity is acceptable. So I thought I'd just mention that again, out of this, trying to deal with things as comprehensively as possible. Just to note, before I finish up, some changes that are coming soon. As far as I can see, we have in the pipeline a discretion allowing deferral of SIL payments for smaller developers. And I think from what I understand, smaller developers is a developer that has a turnover of less than £45 million a year. So there is scope, it's a discretion, it's not a mandatory requirement. There's a discretion on the part of local planning authorities, I think, coming to defer SIL payments for those smaller developers. Perhaps more significantly, there are some changes coming to the use classes order. And they include a new class E that's going to include shops, financial professional services, so A1, A2, cafes, restaurants, A3, indoor sports and fitness, bit of D2, medical health facilities, bit of D1, and B1, office and business uses. So they're all going to be, as far as I understand, they're all going to be gathered together under a new use class that will allow movements between those uses. Now, the government, and this is a quote from Mr. Jenrick, says that is to support the recovery and reimagination, if that's a word, of our high streets and towns. I'm not sure what it's going to do for retail in the middle of high streets and towns. I can see a lot of the shops going, but anyway, that's quite a radical change, and it's intended to be permanent. So there's going to be a big shake-up of the use classes order coming. There are going to be some changes to permitted development rights coming soon as well, and that will include provision for the demolition of certain vacant buildings. It's quite complicated as to which vacant buildings, but I'll leave you to investigate that yourselves without spending time this morning going through it. So demolition of certain vacant buildings and their residential redevelopment, plus provisions to add height to residential buildings. So those new permitted development rights are just coming around the corner. So I think, as far as I'm concerned, I hope I've not missed anything. I can't guarantee that, but I hope, that's my disclaimer, I hope I've not missed anything, and that's a sort of chronological run through of what's happened to date and what I think is about to happen in the next couple of months. Yeah, I hope that's helpful.
It's extremely helpful, thank you, Ian. And we have a really wide audience here, and we've had some more join us since you started your presentation, including the two heads of planning at Newcastle, Sean Fleet, and at Stoke, Harmish, Giselle. So I think it's also equally important to those. And
yeah.
So I'd throw this open to any questions that anybody might have for Ian. If you just want to actually just raise your hand. Thank you, Andy.
Ian, in relation to the additional environmental approval, would you think you've got up to the 31st of December to make the application? So that if the decision comes afterwards, or is deemed afterwards, at the expiry of the periods, that would still keep alive that planning permission?
Yes. So if you have a consent that expires, say, on...
So if you have a consent that expires sometime close to 31st of December, have you got up to the day that it expires to make the application?
Well, just going back to when you have to make an application for an additional environmental approval, that requirement applies to planning permissions that have a date to begin development between the 23rd of March and the 18th of August.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Okay. Yes.
If your planning permission requires you to begin between the 19th of August and the 31st of December, then it's automatically extended and you don't need to make an application.
Yeah. Sorry. So you could make your application up till you can make your application any time then afterwards, can't you? After the 18th of August.
I understand so, because these provisions don't come into force until the 19th of August.
Yes, you can't apply until then.
And the logic is you might have a planning permission that on the face of it has expired already. It expired in April.
Yeah.
And the point is you're allowed to make your application for additional environmental approval following the commencement of these provisions, which is on the 19th of August.
And you can do that any day up till the 31st of December.
I understand that to be the position.
Yeah.
So you could even have, taking the extreme example, you could have a consent that effectively expired on the 24th of March. So you had to begin by the 23rd of March. You could make your application for environmental approval in December.
Okay.
I wouldn't advise leaving it that long.
And can you submit additional information? No. If the guidance is that if it's an EIA development and some of your data might be out of date, given that you could wait right up to the 31st of December, you might have an opportunity to update that information.
I think there is provision for you to provide, you can provide information in support of your application. I think the guidance is probably a little bit blunt where it says if it's EIA development or it's habitats regs development and your original assessments are out of date, then refuse. I mean, I think that's a little bit blunt. If you can provide additional information that brings that assessment up to date, then I don't see why you couldn't get your approval.
Yeah, that's good. So I think the advice would be to review your consent as soon as possible if it's EIA development and see if you might need to bring something up to date so you can get that done in time.
I mean, bearing in mind, I suppose, you could, given that these are planning permissions that are expiring in effect this year, you could have an ES that was produced 4 years ago, 5 years ago. And so there is every chance that bits of it are going to need to be brought up to date. Quite apart from anything else, the planning chapter is likely to need to be brought up to date because it would have been based on the 2012 framework that's been updated in 2018 and 2019.
Okay, that's really helpful, Ian. Thank you.
No problem.
Sean?
Yeah, thanks, Carl. I think this issue of the ecological surveys going out of date is a very important one today, as we're just about to go into August. The reason being is that, as you say, Ian, that some of these applications might have been determined 2 or 3 years ago. So inevitably, those ecological surveys are going to be out of date by now. The risk being that if somebody sort of turns around in late October, November and thinks, actually, I've only got a few weeks left to make my application, and then they find out their bat survey was out of date, it's too late in the year to do the bat survey. They're caught out.
Yes.
So really, if anybody's thinking about extending permissions, they need to be phoning up the ecologist today to try and get that sort of August, September survey in place before the regulations close again and they're trapped. So effectively, they've got to get some of that work done in 6 weeks or so.
Yeah, that must be right, mustn't it?
Thank you. Thanks, Sean.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the Class E, Ian, I think Sarah's probably got something to say about that, because not only is it relevant to our sort of land use-based professionals, but also for the Chief Executive of the Chamber. I think it's got ramifications for the business sector as well. So I wondered if, Sarah, you had any views on that?
Yeah, I do, actually. What a surprise.
I thought so.
And not least because in a few minutes I've got to go to a Business Improvement District board meeting, so I'll give my apologies for that in advance. No, I'm really interested in how some of that is going to work, and this whole idea that the town centres and city centres are going to be looked at again. It seems to me a bit of a where I mean, there's lots of work being done around town deals and city deals and business improvement districts, and the government throwing money at different areas to try and get them to improve, but without really taking into consideration some of the opportunities that the changing class could actually offer. So I think there is a bit of disjointed government on all of that. The bit that I'm also concerned about, I suppose, or interested in, is the change in permitted rights on residential. And how that is going to impact, and also what your views are on the impact of the speed of all of these changes. How long are they going to last? But is this, the government has definitely found that it has got pace. Is it going to carry on using pace to continue to fiddle with things, I suppose, is my point.
Gosh, I wish I could answer that. So we are promised very significant planning reforms, aren't we, in the coming months. So I think the pace of change is which has been rapid. Obviously, there've been some emergency measures. Some of them are going to be permanent measures, like the changes to the youth classes order, the permitted development rights provisions. They are going to be permanent. Others are going to disappear as we hopefully come out of the crisis, such as the extension on consents. But I think the government is committed to shaking up the planning system radically. I don't know quite. We will see what that brings to bear in the next few months. But I don't think that they're not rowing back on that resolution.
I just wondered if some of these were the basis of which that planning reform will happen, and these is like testing some of the waters.
Yeah, no, I think that's undoubtedly the case. I mean, I don't think the change to the youth classes order is really. I know Robert Jenrick has referred to coronavirus being some kind of motivating factor, but I don't think that's it. I think it's part of the government's programme for change, permanent substantive changes to the planning system.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the bit the other bit, which when you were talking struck me, was that different local authorities are going to have different approaches to this, and the whole way that how other businesses will find out what's happening next door to them, in terms of planning permissions and it being much more. It's quite useful having something stuck on your lamppost, is really what I'm saying, I suppose. Yeah. It actually draws people attention to it, and if you haven't got that, I think it is going to set up quite a lot of tension.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, obviously, as we move to kind of a more electronic world, I can see the provisions relating to publicity for planning applications allowing notification by website remaining in place. I mean, they have been brought in to deal with coronavirus, but I can see those staying put, actually.
I suppose that if they've been brought in to deal with coronavirus and actually everyone thinks the world has stopped during coronavirus, that is a different set of circumstances than when everyone is hopefully back hell for leather in their normal lives, having time or inclination or thinking that that is something to check on a regular basis. That would be my point. It's still, because people are interested in their own areas and what's happening locally, it's quite hard to keep on top of even that electronically and digitally.
Yes. Although the number of cases I deal with when I turn up at inquiry and various members of the public say, well, we didn't know anything about this planning application.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Even though a notice has been sat on a lamppost for the last 2.5 years.
Yes. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
Thanks, Sarah. Hamish, morning.
Morning all. Hamish Castle, Stoke-on-Trent City Council. A couple of observations really. Firstly, I understand, I'm hearing rumours that the white paper is expected in the next couple of days. So that will be interesting to see what that actually says. But just coming back to Sarah's point, I think it's really important. I hadn't actually thought about it, to be honest, in that way, about the confidence of, people make investment decisions based on confidence, don't they? They need to understand what's happening next door, what's happening in front of their business, what's happening in their neighbourhood, whatever that neighbourhood may well be. So I think it's quite important that perhaps I need to do some more thinking around this, how things are actually publicised, because in effect, if the use class has changed, allowing a lot of flexibility, a lot of businesses will have no idea who's moving in next door, what they can and what they can't do. But I think this is a real challenge for planning officers and planning authorities, I think.
Yeah.
I've got an answer.
The other point about publicity, Hamish, that no doubt will be important for you.
Yeah.
Is in respect to the production of local plans, because I think what the government are saying there is that councils need to get on with the production of their local plans, and what they might have to do is look at their statements of community involvement and potentially modify those to allow, if you like, a more flexible approach to community involvement, i.e. less, or at least less in terms of physical inspection of documents and so on, more web-based publicity and consultation to facilitate progress with local plan production. And I don't think there's been any statutory change, but as far as I understand, councils are being urged by the government to start looking at their statements of community involvement.
Can I come back on that one, Chair? Is that okay? Yeah. So basically, in Stoke and Newcastle, I speak on behalf of Sean this as well, we are updating our statement of community involvement, and we're going to the council's cabinet in September, October of this year for that very reason, Ian, is actually to allow more virtual and more flexible consultation around the local plan.
Okay.
I think if I come in, it certainly, Hamish beat me to it there, but we are facilitating that because we didn't have that ability back in the spring, which is why we had to drop the part 1 consultation on the plan, because it required us to be in public to do that consultation, which clearly coronavirus stopped. So we had to pull. We don't intend just hiding behind a sort of digital screen and sort of doing the consultation electronically only. There will be sort of some of the work still public facing. But if, for example, coronavirus lockdown catches us in week 6 of a 6-week consultation, we can still be duty bound to complete in accordance with legislation. So we can still try and keep on track with the planned timescale. We don't want to find a situation where we get a legal challenge that says, lockdown prevented me coming to see the plans at the library, therefore you didn't comply with your consultation. And we have to go all the way back through the process and stop the plan again. So trying to be that little bit more dynamic and agile to flex with the system is what's in our mind here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sean. Any other comments before we allow Ian to escape? Just one final comment, Ian. Harmish mentions the white paper and potentially in the next couple of days, which I didn't know about it. So I thought it might be a bit longer. If you had a crystal ball, what would you say could be in it that would radically shake up the? I mean, there's lots of rumours around streamlining the roles of local politicians, a zoning system to the planning system. Lots of radical stuff being talked about.
Carl, I'm not going to speculate.
I didn't think you would.
I've given up trying to do that because I've been proved wrong so many times. So I honestly wouldn't like to speculate, but I'm not going to have a guess, to be honest, because it's too uncertain. But undoubtedly, I think what I can say is that the government appears to remain committed to its headline figure for housing delivery, doesn't it? Of 300,000 units a year. As far as I understand it, they haven't sought to retreat from that position. So I think whatever measures are going to be in the white paper, a lot of them are going to be directed at trying to achieve that objective. And so it will be interesting to see how radical they tend to be.
Okay.
Thank you. So, Carl, I'll send Vicky, I'll send Vicky the little speaking note, and Vicky is able to then distribute that.
Yeah, well, on behalf of the Staffordshire Chambers, Ian, we're very, very grateful for your time this morning. I know how busy you are, and I think that's been very, very informative for us all.
No problem. Well, I'll leave you to get on with your meeting. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Great. Well, that was really helpful and interesting, I think. The next item on the agenda, item 5, is an update on the local plan. So, Harmish or Sean, if you could very kindly update the forum members. Thank you.
Yeah, in terms of the plan, we're still working through the sort of process for that. So we're looking at that autumn period still for the consultation, but we need to be sure about some of our baseline data at the moment. So COVID has had an impact on the process, as you might expect, but it's been twofold. One is that individuals within some of the consultancy firms that we're working with have been furloughed or off work. So we've had that smaller sort of impact on some of the processes coming through. But also COVID's thrown in a bit of a sort of shake-up of what is the future going to be. We've heard about some of these PD changes and other elements, but we're all having this meeting now on the web, whereas 6 months ago it would have been in the office. That whole dynamic of how people work, move, everything else is probably going to change quite dramatically. And I think there will be some slip back to traditional forms going into 2021 as COVID hopefully eases. But to what extent? What is the demand for office space going to be? What will the town centres look like in the future? These are some sort of huge questions which are trying to stare into a crystal ball that is very, very murky at the moment. And that sort of confidence, because what we've got to make decisions today about are decisions that we'll be stuck with as we go through to examination next year or so. So we don't want to be found to be wanting by an inspector when we come to examination who said, why did you assume A, B and C? That's one of the challenges we need to gain some confidence about. So we have got that pressure from COVID on the system, but we are still working ahead with it. Okay, Harmish, you got anything?
No, I think just to can confirm what Sean's already said. I think we're doing a lot of work at the moment regarding, particularly in terms of kind of employment land review and the housing numbers, and I think that's what's taken kind of a lot of time. As Sean mentioned, a lot of staff from the consultants were furloughed, and basically stuff didn't happen for a couple of months. But there will be a very interesting debate to be had when the plan comes out, and I think that the chamber as part of that process is really important, because in effect you see stuff on the ground much quicker than we do as planning authorities. I suppose one of the critical things for me is going to be what the white paper does actually say in terms of zoning. What does it say in terms of town centres? I think that will be kind of fascinating to find out, hopefully in the next couple of days, as the rumour mill is telling me.
Okay, thanks, Hamish. It may well be that, I mean, our next forum meeting is scheduled for, it's going to change because it's scheduled for October half term, so we're going to move that. And we may move it to coincide with the your consultation period. But it may be that we all hold an interim forum meeting to talk about the white paper. And I'm just looking at Vicky's notes. So, yeah, I think it would, I think what she's doing is suggesting that we throw this open to the wider council meeting as well, because it has got such major implications for business in Staffordshire. And
I'm just wondering,
and if I get Sarah to liaise, or Vicky to liaise directly with Sean and Hamish, regarding the dates of the board.
Yeah,
timing is so important. It'd be really good to get something done. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Cheers.
I'm really sorry I'm going to have to go now, but it's nice to see everybody, and thanks very much, Carl, for arranging all of that. That was great. Okay.
Thanks, Sarah. Does anybody have any questions for Sean or Hamish around the joint local plan? No, good. Okay. Just with regards to the Staffordshire Moorlands, the inspector's report is now being published. I haven't yet read it, but I understand that the inspector's recommendations they're just backing up what the officers have said. And the inspector has recommended a review of the plan in 5 years' time if housing delivery falls short of that projected. But what I would ask, Vicky, is if Ben Hayward could join, if we asked Ben to join us next time, and he could deliver that for himself.
I ask, he's invited to all of them. Unfortunately, I think with all this going on, he's been quite busy, but he has been giving us updates. But I'll see if I can perhaps send him an email to make sure that, try and get him to come to the next one in person if he's available, or maybe somebody else. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And similarly, Stafford, I haven't got an update on Stafford at the moment, so we do the same, Vicky. Thank you. Item 6 is any other business. Skills and international trade, Vicky, do you have anything to pick up on there?
It's really just to, so we're putting this on the agenda for all of the forums at the moment to talk about skills and international trade, because to see how skills and what your experiences are of skills in your particular sector and the effect that that's having on businesses, so that we can then report that back to the British Chambers of Commerce, because they're very keen to, obviously there's a skills shortage, so they're very keen to get businesses' views from all the chambers over the country. So we've added it on so that if there's any particular issues or anything anyone wants to mention about skills or international trade, especially with the 31st of the end of December coming upon us, just to see if anyone's got any points of view, anything that you want to add about skills or international trade. That was all.
Okay, thank you. Well, I suspect international trade is perhaps not so relevant to this forum. I suspect more relevant to others. But with regards to skills, does anybody have anything to raise? No. Fine. Good. Just with item C, individual planning applications, we are getting approaches from developers quite often now, and that's the chamber generally for a chamber view on planning applications. We don't tend to, as a policy, comment on individual planning applications, and you'll note that we have sent some of them around. Does anybody have any views, really? It's possibly not relevant for Sean or Hamish, but does anybody have any views about wanting to see planning applications? We're all very busy, and I suggest we don't really get embroiled in assessing and commenting on planning applications, but other people might have alternative views to that. I think if we get a particular planning application that might have strategic implications, one, for example, might be the redevelopment of the Rycroft site, that we do get involved in and comment on those applications. But otherwise, I've put it on the agenda because I'm quite keen to hear anybody's views on this. And as by way of an example, we were asked for views on a little supermarket in Burslem, and we sent that around, and it was Alison Walters who commented on quite a detailed assessment of the landscape issues, and which was very helpful. And we sent those back to the council, back to Stoke Council. But I think, Vicky, we'll just continue the policy of not commenting on individual planning applications unless you and I think there's strategic implications.
Okay, brilliant. I get them to come through from, they come through from info, because they come through to our info inbox and automatically get sent on to me. So I'll send them to you, Carl. And if you feel like it might be something for the forum to have a look at and perhaps discuss, then we can look at it and put them on the agenda. But otherwise, I won't do anything with them.
Okay, thank you. Item D is legislation updates, but I think we've covered that through Ian this morning.
Sorry, just to go back, Carl, can I confirm you do want to receive notifications of applications?
Yes, we do want to receive it, and and then we'll decide internally, rather than overburden the forum, we'll decide which ones we consult on.
That's fine, thanks.
Thank you.
Carl, can you hear me?
I can, Patrick, yes.
Yeah, coming back to the skills element, I understand Staffordshire University want to establish a School of Architecture over the next year or so, and I don't know what they've done in terms of speaking to the chamber on that fact. It might be worth keeping an eye on that prospect. I know we're involved as the North Staff Society of Architects in hearing about the intention, but it can only be a good thing in my view. And needs to be positively encouraged, I'd say.
Completely. I hadn't heard that, Patrick.
Yeah.
I had you, Vicky.
No, I'll mention it to Sarah though. She's on the Board of Governors, so she may have heard something about it, but I will anyway mention it to her. Thanks, Patrick.
No problem.
Can I just add to that, if I may? Yeah, that'd be really good, actually. Think to have a local School of Architecture, and kind of, I'm sure, kind of from Sean and my perspective, if kind of they need any support from us, we're happy to give them support.
Good. Okay. In terms of date of the next forum is scheduled. We will come back to you on that because it's scheduled for October half term, and we do avoid school holidays, other than this one, of course, but. So we will come back and we'll try and tie in Harmish and Sean with the JLP consultation period. Does anybody have any other business? No? Okay, well, I'll thank you for your attendance. Hopefully you found Ian's commentary on the legislation changes interesting. It's a very interesting time for planning, probably more so than ever, really. And we'll wait to see what comes in the white paper. I don't envy Sean and Harmish's roles here, but it's a full-time job keeping up with these legislative changes at the moment. And as Andrea will testament, we have somebody in our team, Alan, who loves doing it. And I don't think he sleeps at night, but he actually enjoys it. So. Vicky, he's done a really helpful note on all of this, so I'll circulate it to the forum this afternoon, and then well, I'll send it to you, and you can circulate it.
Yeah, if you send anything to me, that'd be great, and then I can just send it all out in one big email. Just for those who are a little bit late arriving, Ian did say that he was going to send all the notes on what he spoke about. He's going to send those notes through to me, and I'll send them around with the minutes, and hopefully the minutes are quite short today because Ian did all the talking, so hopefully I'll get those out in the next few days.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vicky. So I'll thank you all again. Have a good day, and I'll formally close the meeting.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.